Before the first Europeans set foot on what is now the United States, the continent was already inhabited by numerous indigenous peoples. They had diverse cultures, languages, and ways of life, adapting to various climatic conditions and geographical regions. Some of the largest civilizations in prehistory included the Mississippian culture in the Mississippi Valley, as well as groups in the Southwest and the West, particularly in what is now New Mexico and Arizona. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer working for the Spanish crown, reached the Americas. Although Columbus was not the first European to discover America, the Vikings, led by Leif Erikson, had reached North America as early as the 10th century. His voyages triggered a large wave of European settlers to the New World. Soon, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and England competed for the right to claim and colonize territories in both the Americas. By the early 17th century, the English established their first permanent settlements on the east coast of North America. English colonization, struggles for land and resources. In 1607, the English established the first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia, where they began cultivating tobacco, which quickly became a major export. Over the next few decades, other English colonies were founded along the eastern seaboard, while the Spanish focused on territories in California, Texas, and the Southwest, and the French concentrated in the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley regions. However, colonization was far from painless. Indigenous peoples encountered Europeans, and this led to numerous conflicts. Europeans also brought diseases, which devastated the indigenous population, sometimes wiping out as much as 90% of the population in some regions. Relations between settlers and indigenous groups were tense, with Europeans pushing Native American tribes off their lands. One of the greatest disasters for indigenous peoples was the policy of conquest and assimilation initiated after British colonization. The American Revolution, the path to independence. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire dominated much of North America, but the colonies began to feel resentment over high taxes and restrictions imposed by the British government. To cover the costs of wars with France, Britain levied taxes on goods like tea, paper, and glass. This led to a series of protests, which eventually escalated into the American Revolution. In 1775, hostilities broke out between the colonists and British troops. The primary reason for the conflict was that the colonists were being taxed without having representation in Parliament. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry for the revolution. In 1776, after years of strained relations with the mother country, the 13 colonies declared independence from Britain. On July 4 of that year, the Declaration of Independence was adopted, not only proclaiming the creation of a new nation but also enshrining ideals of liberty, equality, and democratic rights. The revolution lasted until 1783, when Britain officially recognized the United States' independence with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the Constitution, and the formation of a new government. After the war, the former colonies faced the challenge of creating a new political system. Initially, the Articles of Confederation were adopted, but they proved to be too weak to effectively govern the new nation. In 1787, the U.S. Constitution was drafted and came into effect in 1789, establishing a strong federal government with 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. George Washington became the first president of the United States, and under his leadership, the country began to organize its government, emphasizing the need to balance power between the national government and individual states. The Bill of Rights, which protected basic freedoms, was added shortly afterward. Expansion and economic development. Throughout the 19th century, the United States expanded its territory rapidly. In 1803, the U.S. purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, nearly doubling the size of the country. Territorial acquisitions in the West, including Texas and California, became the foundation for the country's further growth. This period also saw the development of industry and railroads, which helped link the vast regions of the country. However, territorial expansion raised the contentious issue of slavery. The southern states, where the economy relied on slave labor for plantations, wanted to expand slavery into new territories, while the northern states, where slavery had been abolished, opposed it. The Civil War, the issue of slavery. The conflict between the North and South ultimately led to the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, one of the most significant events in U.S. history. The Southern states, led by the Confederacy, fought to maintain slavery, while the Northern states fought to abolish it. The war ended with the victory of the Union, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, abolishing slavery across the entire country. Reconstruction followed, a process aimed at reintegrating the Southern states into the Union, but racial tensions and struggles for the rights of African Americans continued. Industrialization and the U.S. as a world power. By the end of the 19th century, the United States underwent rapid industrialization. Major cities became economic hubs, and railroads connected the nation from coast to coast. At the same time, the U.S. began to assert itself as a global power. In 1898, the U.S. won the Spanish-American War, gaining control of Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, expanding its territory and influence. By the 20th century, the United States emerged as the world's leading economic and military power. Though the U.S. entered World War I late, its involvement helped secure the Allied victory in 1918. After the war, the U.S. faced the Great Depression in the 1930s but recovered through President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies. World War II and the Cold War. World War II was a turning point for the United States. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. entered the war and contributed to the defeat of the Axis powers by 1945. With its economic and military might, the U.S. emerged from the war as one of the two global superpowers, alongside the Soviet Union. The Cold War began shortly after World War II, a geopolitical rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that lasted until the early 1990s. The U.S. led the Western Bloc, and military conflicts in places like Korea and Vietnam became part of this broader ideological struggle. The U.S. in the late 20th and early 21st century. In the late 20th century, the United States continued to play a dominant role on the world stage. It was deeply involved in global organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and the World Trade Organization. In 2001, following the terrorist attacks on September 11, the U.S. launched the War on Terror, which led to invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. This marked a challenging period for the country, leaving lasting impacts on its internal and external policies. The U.S. also faced the 2008 financial crisis, which affected the global economy. However, the country managed to recover relatively quickly. In the 2010s, the U.S. faced new challenges, including political polarization, social inequality, and debates over climate change and immigration.